So perhaps, Gerald, you could say a few words about intellectual virtues as a whole, the again, smaller set of concepts that we see as core, as beginning places for teaching and learning and for our own development as thinkers.
Yeah, let me say a little bit about it. So so one thing I want to say is that the intellectual virtues, I often call them traits or traits of mind or character traits. Some people call them dispositions, but that when I use that with my students, it throws everything off because they think of a disposition as like having a sunny disposition or a sour disposition, and it doesn't mean disposition in that sense at all. But but these are a set of traits or a way of being or a tendency in the way you are. And what that highlights is that the intellectual virtues or the intellectual traits they're not skills. They're associated with some skills, but they're not skills or abilities. So intellectual perseverance is not the ability to stick with an intellectual task all the way through. It's having a tendency to stick with an intellectual task all the way through. So I think of them a lot as part of a tendency we have and that we can develop to a much further degree so that we tend to be intellectual persevering or intellectual, having a greater degree of intellectual humility. So that's one thing. Here's something else about the virtues as a whole. When I think of critical thinking, if I think of critical thinking itself, I see it as having really two parts. And that's the elements of reasoning and the standards of critical thinking, the intellectual standards. That is, if I'm thinking critically, what I'm doing is I'm thinking about my assumptions, say, or the points of view that are relevant and about the information I'm gathering. I'm thinking about those elements of reasoning, and I'm doing it in a way that's as clear as I can make it, that is as accurate as I can assess, that's relevant. So I think of the critical thinking as involving the elements and the standards. So how do the virtues come in? Well, there's someone who does the critical thinking, and the virtues inhabit the person. So I think of the virtues as the characteristics of a critical thinker. So if I distinguish critical thinker from critical thinking, then the virtues partly, to a great degree, establish almost your identity as a critical thinker. They they're essential in developing the skills of critical thinking and of using the standards well and of applying the elements, but they fall into a different grouping. A third thing in general I want to say is that the word intellectual can often throw people off. So one of the virtues we're going to discuss is intellectual empathy, and it's intellectual empathy, and that's different from empathy. It's different from empathy, pure and simple. Empathy is often characterized as putting myself in another person's feelings or in another person's experience, whereas intellectual empathy is putting myself into another person's thinking or reasoning. How is this person reasoning through things? And so there's sometimes a grave danger in empathy. If I empathize too completely with someone who is vicious or a dictator or an offensive system, if I empathize with them too much, I can get involved in the emotionality of it, and that can do me some harm. Whereas intellectual empathy is safe in that it's putting myself only into their reasoning, not into their state of mind. I don't mean only into their reasoning, because it's often considerably difficult to do that, but it doesn't have that danger. So when we talk about intellectual humility or intellectual courage or intellectual perseverance, we mean the part of courage that has to do with thinking or critical thinking, or the part of courage, humility or perseverance that has to do with critical thinking. So if I persevere at a non-intellectual task, that's different from intellectual perseverance. I'm not saying it's negative. I'm just saying it falls into a different category. So so those are I guess the three things I would like to say about them in general to kind of
Okay.
situate us. Go ahead.
So we call these again intellectual traits or intellectual virtues, and we can make an argument that intellectual virtue is maybe the best term from the point of view of understanding that if it's a virtue, it's naturally something that is reasonable and something that we desire. And a trait, again, can be neutral. You can have a negative or a positive trait, but you can't have a negative virtue. It would be a vice. So virtue serves that purpose of bringing in also bringing in the ethical dimension and making it again a positive term by implication, something we would want to achieve. So intellectual humility, intellectual courage, intellectual empathy, intellectual autonomy, intellectual integrity, intellectual perseverance, and confidence in reason, fair-mindedness, and we can add to that short list very quickly, so to speak. Now, before we begin to burrow into these, I would like to just mention some of the other intellectual virtues that we tend to mention and to again remind us that we are taking 8 from many others, and some of them have we could have used possibly instead of. But in any case, for example, some that come to mind that sometimes people will mention these, or sometimes I will say them or you will say them: intellectual discipline, intellectual responsibility, intellectual civility, intellectual curiosity. Those are often mentioned. I often use the term intellectual discipline, and or just say disciplined thinking.